General Audience number 128 of October 24th, 1984. In keeping with what we announced, today we are taking up the analysis of the virtue of continence. Continence, which is part of the more general virtue of temperance, consists in the ability to master, control, and orient the sexual drives, concupiscence of the flesh, and their consequences in the psychosomatic subjectivity of human beings. As a constant disposition of the will, such an ability deserves to be called virtue. We know from the earlier analyses that the concupiscence of the flesh and the corresponding sexual desire aroused by it expresses itself with a specific drive in the sphere of somatic reactivity and further with a psychoemotive arousal of the sexual impulse. In order to reach mastery over this drive and arousal, the personal subject must devote himself or herself to a progressive education in self-control of the will, of sentiments, of emotions, which must be developed from the simplest gestures, in which it is relatively easy to put the inner decision into practice. This education obviously presupposes the clear perception of the values expressed in the norm and the consequent maturation of firm convictions that give rise to the corresponding virtue, provided they are accompanied by the corresponding disposition of the will. This is precisely the virtue of continence, self-mastery, which reveals itself as the fundamental condition both for the reciprocal language of the body to remain in the truth and for the spouses to, quote, be subject to one another in the fear of Christ, according to the words of the Bible, Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21. This reciprocal submission signifies the shared concern for the truth of the language of the body, while submission in the fear of Christ indicates the gift of the fear of God, a gift of the Holy Spirit, which accompanies the virtue of continence. This is very important for an adequate understanding of the virtue of continence, and in particular of so-called periodic continence discussed in Humanae Vitae. The conviction that the virtue of continence opposes the concupiscence of the flesh is correct, but it is not entirely complete. It is not complete, especially when we consider the fact that this virtue does not appear and act abstractly and thus in isolation, but always in connection with the other virtues. Nexus virtutum, the link between the virtues, and thus in connection with prudence, justice, fortitude, and above all with love. In the light of these considerations, it is easy to understand that continence is not limited to offering resistance against the concupiscence of the flesh, but through this resistance also opens itself to the deeper and more mature values that are part of the spousal meaning of the body in its femininity and masculinity, as well as to that authentic freedom of the gift in this reciprocal relationship of persons. Inasmuch as it seeks first of all fleshly and sensual enjoyment, the concupiscence of the flesh makes man in some way blind and insensitive to the deeper values that spring from love, and that at the same time constitute love in the inner truth proper to it. In this way, the essential character of conjugal chastity also becomes clear in its organic link with the power of love, which is poured out in the hearts of the spouses together with the consecration of the sacrament of marriage. It becomes evident further that the invitation addressed to the spouses to be subject to one another in the fear of Christ seems to open up the interior room in which both become ever more sensitive to the deeper and more mature values connected with the spousal meaning of the body and the true freedom of the gift. If conjugal chastity, and chastity in general, manifests itself as first as an ability to resist the concupiscence of the flesh, it subsequently reveals itself as a singular ability to perceive, love, and realize those meanings of the language of the body that remain completely unknown to concupiscence itself, and progressively enrich the spousal dialogue of the couple by purifying, deepening, and at the same time, simplifying it. For this reason, the ascesis of continence, about which the encyclical speaks from paragraph 21 of Humanae Vitae, does not impoverish effective manifestations, but on the contrary, it makes them spiritually more intense and thus enriches them. When we analyze continence in this way, in the anthropological, ethical, and theological dynamics proper to this virtue, we realize that the apparent contradiction often brought in as an objection against Humanae Vitae and against the Church's teaching about conjugal morality, disappears. That is, according to those who raise this objection, there would be a contradiction between the two meanings of the conjugal act, the unitive and the procreative meaning, see Humanae Vitae, paragraph 12, and such that if it were not licit to separate them, the spouses would be deprived of the right to conjugal union when they cannot responsibly allow themselves to procreate. To this apparent contradiction, the encyclical Humanae Vitae offers an answer, if one studies it in depth. Indeed, Pope Paul VI confirms that there is no such contradiction, but only a difficulty linked with the whole inner situation of the man of concupiscence. Precisely by reason of this difficulty, the true order of conjugal life, with a view to which the spouses are, quote, strengthened and, as it were, consecrated, Humanae Vitae, paragraph 25, by the sacrament of marriage, is assigned to their interior and ascetical commitment. This order of conjugal life signifies, further, the subjective harmony between responsible parenthood and personal communion, a harmony created by conjugal chastity. It is indeed in this harmony that the inner fruits of continence mature. Through this inner maturation, the conjugal act itself acquires the importance and dignity proper to it in its potentially procreative meaning. At the same time, an adequate meaning is given to all the effective manifestations that serve to express the personal communion of the spouses in proportion to the subjective richness of femininity and masculinity. In keeping with experience and the tradition, the encyclical points out that the conjugal act is also a manifestation of affection, Humanae Vitae, paragraph 16, but a particular manifestation of affection, because at the same time, it has a potentially procreative meaning. Consequently, it is oriented toward expressing personal union, but not only union. At the same time, although only indirectly, the encyclical points out many manifestations of affection that are exclusively an expression of the personal union of the spouses. The task of conjugal chastity, and still more specifically of continence, lies not only in protecting the importance and the dignity of the conjugal act in relation to its potentially procreative meaning, but also in safeguarding the importance and dignity proper to the conjugal act inasmuch as it expresses interpersonal union by revealing to the consciousness and experience of the spouses all the other possible manifestations of affection that are to express their deep communion. It is indeed a question of not doing harm to the communion of the spouses when they should abstain from the conjugal act for right reasons. Still more, it is a question of this communion, which is continually built up day by day through suitable effective manifestations, constituting, so to speak, a vast terrain on which, under suitable conditions, the decision for a morally right conjugal act matures.